Hey folks, it's Will here from Flow Mountain Bike and welcome to this video review of the 2023 Trek Fuel EXe. Now this bike is all new this year and there is a lot to talk about. In this video we'll be going to some of the tech behind the new Fuel EXe, but more importantly we'll be talking about how this bike rides on the trail. We'll be going into detail about what we like about it, what we don't like about it, and also how it compares to the previous version and some of the competition. So without further ado, let's get stuck in. The Fuel EXe is Trek's mid-travel ride all of the things trail bike. It gets a brand new frame for this year which is made in both carbon and alloy variants. There's been a 10mm increase in suspension travel. We now have 150mm travel fork and 140mm of rear travel. Now the ABP suspension design does carry over, but there have been updates to the kinematics, notably with a higher main pivot which is designed to increase anti-squat and improve pedaling performance. There's also a ton of versatility that's been built into this bike. The new Fuel EXe frame is rated for use with up to 160mm travel fork, and it also features the Minnow Link, which is a 2-position geometry flip chip. The new frame is also mullet compatible. Trek recommends flipping the Minnow Link into the high position and setting up the fork at 160mm travel in order to maintain the proper ride height. New for the Fuel EXe, there's a 2-position flip chip in the lower shock mount which allows you to alter the leverage rate of the rear suspension. In the more progressive setting, the Fuel EXe frame is coil shock ready. The new frame also incorporates modular headset cups which allows you to steepen or slacken the head angle by a full degree either way. Speaking of geometry and sizing, whereas most brands typically offer their bikes in 3 or 4 frame sizes, the Fuel EXe is available in 7. At 175cm tall, I've been riding a medium size which has a 450mm reach. Thanks to the use of short seat tubes, however, a rider of my height could easily fit the next size up, though I've personally found the fit to be spot on the medium. Now in its stock configuration, the Fuel EXe has a 64.5 degree head angle and a 77.5 degree effective seat tube angle. Another new feature of this frame is the adoption of size-specific rear center lengths. The chainstays themselves are the same, but the pivot location on the main frame moves forwards or backwards in order to alter the rear center length. Now on the medium frame, we've got a 435mm rear center, but that grows up to 450mm on the larger sizes. Along with the in-frame storage, the generous frame armouring, guided internal cable routing, and a threaded bottom bracket, the Fuel EXe appears to pack in almost everything you could possibly want from a modern trail bike. It's certainly a very appealing package on paper, and one that's ready to take on contemporaries like the Specialized Stumpjumper, the Giant Trans X, and the Canyon Spectral. Now there are a number of models in the Trek Fuel EXe lineup for 2023, though availability will vary depending on where you are in the world. In Australia, we'll see 4 of the new Fuel EXe models coming to our shores, 2 with alloy frames and 2 with carbon frames. For a closer look at the specs and prices of all the new bikes, click the link in the video description below to check out the full review. The bike that we've been testing is the top-end Trek Fuel EXe 9.9 XX1 Axis model, which will be available in Australia in very limited quantities through the Project One bike builder. This bike was supplied to us by Trek, and of course it comes dripping in lots of carbon, Kashima and wireless bits. As usual with our reviews though, we won't be focusing on the Gucci level spec. Instead we'll be focusing on the attributes that are shared throughout the Fuel EXe lineup, that being the frame design, the suspension performance and its on-trail handling. That said, I do want to touch on the weight of our test bike because it came in at 14.4 kilos on the workshop scales. That's weighed with the tyre setup tubeless and without pedals. It is on the heavier side given the level of spec, though it's worth noting that it does have a pretty burly build kit. We've got a Fox 36 fork and a Flodex shock, 2.5-inch wide Bontrager SE5 tyres and SRAM Code RSC brakes with heavy-duty HS2 rotors. Another contributing factor is the frame, which is claimed to weigh 3.4 kilos including the rear shock. That is quite a bit heavier than the old Fuel EXe, though it's also over a kilo heavier than a Specialized Stumpjumper frame. Of course, weight isn't everything, but for those who are concerned by grams, there are certainly lighter options on the market. As to how this bike rides on the trail, With its added muscle and updated geometry, the new Fuel EXe is without doubt the burliest iteration yet. Indeed, it is massively capable for a 140mm travel bike, with the slack head angle and the roomy wheelbase giving it a purposeful stance on the trail. The chassis feels near bomb-proof, and combined with the supportive suspension, the powerful brakes and the high volume rubber, you're served up a load of confidence whenever you point this thing downhill. The geometry all round is superb, though in particular, the steeper seat tube angle puts you in an improved position on the climbs. Pedal efficiency is also leveled up thanks to the increased anti-squat, and while the Float X shock does have a 2-position climb switch, I never felt the need to use it while I was riding off-road. Once up to speed, the taut chassis means the Fuel EXe is highly responsive when rounding corners and pushing into berms. The frame is heavily reinforced to resist torsional flex, and that helps to translate your handling inputs while resisting lateral deflection through the turns. The short back end and the low bottom bracket also help here, keeping you connected to the terrain whilst also contributing to the playful ride quality. Indeed, the riding position and weight distribution are totally sorted, and the Fuel EXe doesn't demand a whole lot from you as the rider. It does need a more concerted lean into tighter corners compared to the old bike, though this is all just part of the natural evolution of modern trail bike geometry. Even if you're coming off a 5-year-old bike, it'll only take you a couple of rides to get used to the Fuel EXe's handling. Now, in addition to the minnow link, we've also been experimenting with that lower shock flip chip. You only need a 6mm hex key, and it's a quick adjustment to make on the side of the trail, with the change in suspension behaviour being quite noticeable between those two settings. I ended up preferring the less progressive setting, which provides a more linear leverage rate. This provides great pedalling support, but it also means there's a bit more activity and comfort deeper into the travel. There's still good progression though, and combined with the Float X's big bottom-out bumper, hitting full travel is a pretty innocuous and well-controlled affair. One of our other testers preferred the more progressive setting, which increases progression and provides a stronger ramp up in the latter half of the travel. Pedal efficiency isn't quite as stable, though it does mean the Fuel EXe takes to jumps like a duck to water, popping off lips enthusiastically and absorbing hard landings with a solid and flex-free touchdown. One thing to note on the flip chip is that while it alters the progression of the air spring, it also affects the damping too. We needed to tweak the rebound and compression dials when adjusting between those two settings, so while it is a very useful and effective tool, it doesn't totally dispel the need for air volume spacers. As for what we don't like about this bike, with the beefier frame, the added weight is noticeable compared to lighter bikes in this category. That's compounded by the heavy-duty brakes, the stocky wheels and the chunky tyres, which means there's more inertia to overcome during micro-accelerations on a technical and undulating climb. I'd suggest that riders who are after a lighter and sprightlier trail bike for whipping around on smoother single track will probably be better served by looking at the latest Top Fuel instead. The Fuel EXe chassis is also quite stiff, and the rear suspension isn't as plush as previous Fuel EXe models, particularly those that came with a through-shaft shock. Now, you may have noticed that Trek has been moving away from proprietary suspension components lately, which is why the new Fuel EXe doesn't have a through-shaft shock. There's also been a greater focus on building bikes with a more neutral pedaling performance. In the case of the new Fuel EXe, the increased anti-squat is one part of the equation, the other part being the custom-tuned shock, which Trek has configured with a digressive compression tune on the main piston. This creates a decent low-speed threshold, providing a level of support that sits in between the open and medium settings on the previous through-shaft shock. The result is that you can have the shock fully open, and the Fuel EXe still provides great pedaling stability with no real need for the climb switch on the shock. The downside is that the suspension isn't as supple over smaller rubble and at slower speeds. Along with the stiff chassis and the carbon wheels, there are more vibrations that are transmitted up to the rider. Because there is more support through the suspension, however, your feet have a stronger platform to push off of, with greater feedback during peak load scenarios, like when you're pushing through a high-speed berm. Indeed, the harder and faster you push, the better the Fuel EXe gets. In this sense, it's less of a comfy cruiser and more of a mid-travel bruiser that loves to ride hard and fast. Now, alongside the Fuel EXe, the Specialized Stumpjumper is without doubt one of the most popular trail bikes in this category, and it's also a bike I've been spending a lot of time on this year, both in its stock configuration and in a burlier mullet setup. Compared to the Fuel EXe, the Stumpjumper does have a touch less travel with a 140mm fork and 130mm at the rear. It also has a simpler flex stay suspension design, and combined with slimmer tubing, the carbon frame is claimed to weigh under 2.3 kilos with the shock. The build kit follows a similar theme with specialised specking, a skinnier and lighter Fox 34, an inline shock, lighter brakes, wheels and tyres. The end result is a much lighter bike overall. For example, the Stumpjumper Pro that we previously tested came in at 12.84 kilos, which is much lighter than this top-end Fuel EXe. While the geometry is pretty similar between the two bikes, the Stumpjumper does ride much lighter on the trail. It's more comfortable with the slender chassis and the smooth suspension performance, providing more compliance over rough terrain. It's quite sporty and sprightly, though the active suspension does need taming on the climbs by making use of the rear shock's compression lever. In comparison, the Fuel EXe is more naturally efficient. It's also more planted at speed with a sturdy frame and supportive suspension, providing better big hit capability. It really feels like a short travel enduro bike, which is going to suit heavier and harder riders quite well. Now, while that does wrap up our video on the 2023 Trek Fuel EXe, as per usual, there is a ton more information in the full review over at flowmountainbike.com, which is totally free for you to access. In there, you'll find more detail on things like sizing and suspension setup, so make sure you click the link in the video description below to check out the full review of this bike right here. If you've got any questions for me about the new Fuel EXe, make sure you drop those into the comments below. Otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and we'll see you next time. Tooroo!